But yeah, my name is Brendan Fernandes. Again, thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work, but before that, I'm just going to introduce myself for accessibility purposes. Brendan Fernandes, male identifying male with brown skin. I have a beard. I'm wearing glasses today and a black ball cap, and I'm in my apartment where I'm behind some art. I also use the pronoun he, him. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and how I think about my work through dance and visual arts. I use a lot of film and sculpture and architecture and asking the body to work with it. Sometimes it's a burden, sometimes it's something that supports the body. So I really question the spaces of labor, and I think about solidarity and protest a lot. So I'm going to show you a couple of works. I'm going to share my screen. And then I'm going to go to that presentation that now has disappeared on me. One second. We practiced this and it worked really well. And now here we go. So I'm going to show a number of works, and I'm going to talk to you about the ways that I've been thinking about it, specifically thinking about queer spaces and what is a queer space. And I gave out the Munoz text from Cruising Utopia, the introduction. And I really wanted to kind of focus on what the notion of queer means and queer space. And for me, you know, as a person who identifies as being queer, I think about, you know, bodies in gathering, bodies that have choice, bodies that socially, politically have, as subjects, have ways to self-identify. That creates a space of inclusivity. And for me, I use dance as a way to collaborate and bring bodies together. And right now, in this moment of time, like, we're really being challenged with what can we do with our bodies together. So in this first slide here, this is a piece called I'm Down, which happened in Santa Monica, California. You'll have an image of a number of dancers holding their hands in a human chain, formation, and they're wearing somewhat like a uniform. And then there's another two participants carrying a banner and on it, they all say, "We are moving change." And in this piece, I wanted to gather people. So to find us, we would move through the city without any sort of like space where we were going. But if you wanted to find us, you'd have to text to a number, "I'm down," and then we would send you directives of where you could find us. But obviously, as we're moving through the streets, this performance is outside, we are gathering people who come up to us and ask us the questions like, what is moving change? And even that idea of what is moving change is sort of, you know, it's abstract, but change comes from the space of queering as well. Within queerness, I want us to define a new space, a space that is as I said, like, you know, solidarity exists within it, but there's also an inclusivity, but there's a change. And in the Munoz text, there was a lot of questions about, you know, I'm just reading some of my notes here, you know, have we ever imagined that space? Where is that space? So in moving change, we're trying to find that space. And so we move through the city space, kind of moving, and there's moments of motifs. In this choreography, I work with them, I'm giving them tasks. But one of the tasks, for example, was that they had to kind of perform protest. And even just the idea of them moving as this group through the city space, wearing this kind of uniform, people were questioning them like, what are you guys protesting? They already got this question. And we always had one dancer who was allowed to speak outside of the score and to respond to the questions. Because my work also is about creating dialogue. It's about communication. It's about finding, you know, that those moments where we can talk and create discussion. So again, forming this kind of like protest dance started, you know, having people come, you know, together, people, and then others would be texting and then would come and follow us. And it was this kind of like Pied Piper line of people just kind of like moving through the city space. And then we ended here. And this last slide is a mural that I created for for the piece at the end, and we always gather here at the end of each time we did it. And this is on a large city wall outside of the institution, 18th Street Art Center, that commissioned me to do this choreographic piece. And it says in 3 different languages, our days begin and end as stories. So in English, Chinese, Spanish, and Japanese. So kind of referencing back to the community. And part of the moving change was that, this area was being gentrified. This area was being challenged by new, by new ownership of properties, and was challenging this community. So moving change was also referencing back to the idea that, we need to find solidarity and support communities that also gentrify and create space in places that, were being colonized by people beforehand, but now they've made their space here, and how that's being challenged as well. So moving to another moment, this piece here is called Steady Pulse. It's a number of dancers laying on a floor wearing these kind of vibrant jumpsuits. And the piece was based on a 3-month score. And I wanted to make it a very open, porous score. And so every time you would come into the space, we performed it for 3 months, and we did it 4 days a week. You would come into the space and the dancers would be learning the process with me, with, one day you might come in and they were getting their costumes made. But slowly, as we began to understand the score or form the score, it became something that just kind of happened. It was a very collaborative process. And so again, collaboration, generosity, kindness, exchange is how I work with my dancers. We work with each other to make something. And I think that's something that comes up a lot in my work. And again, back to the Munoz, reading, that queer space for me is that type of space. So I don't know if we have gotten there as yet, as he states, but I also question this idea of like trying to find ways to kind of engage it. And I think we can engage it when we have a greater community all supporting that kind of cause. So this piece was an ode to the victims of Pulse Orlando. And I think a lot about spaces that for me create sanctuary and freedom. And the club in New York, like before I moved to Chicago, I was living in New York. And so the dance club became a place for me to find freedom and sanctuary, to find commonality with people like me, spaces where I felt invisible. Like I didn't have to be, seen as anything. I didn't have to hide my identity. And so in this space here, we created in the storefront in Soho, New York, I kind of created a very, minimal set. So in this slide here, you're seeing the dancers engaging with these large boards that are flesh tone painted. There's coat hangers, there's coat racks, there's yoga mats. And I was thinking a lot about body indexes, how a coat hanger is a body index. There's 49 coat hangers in this space, 49 to symbolize the 49 people that fell and didn't get up and leave the club after the Pulse Orlando massacre. And there's an ode to celebration as well. So in this piece, I think about the dance floor as a space of resistance, the dance club as a space of resistance, socially and politically. When I work with my dancers, we always talk about the dance floor. How does that dance floor penetrate and hit my body as I move on it? What is the residue of that floor, that architectural space that we forget? How does that enter our bodies? But also at the same time, how do our bodies, create resistance on it? And so for dancers, we always think about, having a sprung floor when we dance, because it allows our bodies to labor longer and to have more, to endure fortitude and to keep dancing. And so in this piece, you have this set. And you see the floorboards have these like rubber sponges that kind of create resistance. So they don't have to dance on the concrete floor. They always dance on these platforms that become pedestals. They're always changing. And one of the tasks for them when they come into the space was to change the space. Every time they come in, to make a new space, to make it different, to queer the space is how I kind of define it. And in that queering of the space, there's always a new challenge, a new expression, a new possibility. And so going back to Munoz's thing about saying that this is, that it's queer for me is something that's always in flux, it's always changing. And that's partially why I think in the text he says, or he suggests, that we can't ever get there. I also think a lot about it through a Marxist theory, that, this idea of a queer space, kind of lines up with the Marxist theory of the imaginary, that we are currently living in a space that is, we are trying to find challenge, or remove ourselves from challenge and find solidarity and gain our civil rights, but it's always in an imagined space. So we're still thinking about it through that possibility. So in this piece, every day for 3 months, when they would come into the space, they would have to imagine a new space and move the boards. And within it, I also did a lot of social programming where we would have talks, and we would gather into the space, or we would have a dance party. And so it became more of a very open space, a welcoming space, a safe space. So within that, I also think about a safe space as a queer space as well. And, it became a thing where the dancers just also understood the space. It became something that was new in the beginning, but then something that was also familiar, even though within the change, there was a familiarity of how they could move and how they would create the process. A lot of my work deals with, the questions of visibility as a queer POC, the question of who supports my body, who takes care of my body. And this piece on on Flashing Lights, this is the poster for it, spoke to police violence and the way that, police, for me, have never protected my body, have never given, my community a space to feel safe. There's a presence, but there's nothing that is coming to support me. And I'm from Toronto originally, and in Toronto, there was a large tension between the police and the POC queer community, because we did not feel that we were being taken care of. And so for this piece, I worked with a festival called Nuit Blanche, and we created this moment, this kind of gathering. And so I asked, and so what I did was, in this image here, I've hired, I think 25 cars from a movie studio. They're all white. They're lined up in side by side, and they all have a siren attached to them. And in the center, there's a stage. And so I hired 10 POC queer identifying DJs to play a party. We made a party and we invited people to come. But we are now gathering, so again, bringing people together to dance in celebratory and in solidarity, but we're dancing to the pulsations of the police sirens. So in this image here, you have one of the DJs performing, and then in the front of the DJ booth are the crowds of people just dancing. And towards the end of the night, we had gathered 10,000 people. But there's this kind of tension where you're like, we're having a good time. The club is meant to be this good time. But I was thinking, like, what is that moment of aha? Like, why are you dancing to these lights of a police car? So the animation of the party is pushed forward by these police sirens. And you can see that they kind of really create an animation. And then the real police are also in the space because they knew about this gathering. So they were just driving around us, which for me, I was happy because it added more to the animation of the piece. Also, I should posit that we're in front of City Hall. So it was, a political gesture. So part of my agenda as an artist is to make dance political, to take things that we see as being, like dance parties or movements, to posit the poignant, like agency that we can create through dance as well. So I really want to push that kind of agenda. And for me, that goes back into queering the space, making dance different as well within my craft. And even within my intersectionality of being a visual artist and a dance artist, there's a sense of hybridity that changes it. People are always like, well, are you a dancer? Or are you an artist? And I'm like, I'm both. And it's this thing where they have to kind of constantly we have to justify one or the other. And I've also had to do that a lot with my cultural identity. You know, are you, you know, Kenyan? Are you Canadian? Are you, you know, American? And I'm like, I am from all of those spaces, because I also think a lot about how cultural identity or identities are in flux and are always in change, and that we're always becoming something. And that becoming, for me, is that kind of tension of what is queer space. I think I'm talking too long, so I might just go through these quickly, but this is a dance film where I brought a number of dancers together to think about their bodies as they fell, kind of positing back to the Pulse Orlando piece, Steady Pulse. And here we have, you know, dancers moving together, but also when they fall in the film, they pick each other up and they support each other. So within a queer space, I think about that idea of social solidarity where we take care of each other as well. That there's an idea of that we have to support each other. We have to be more social. We have to be thinking about collaboration. And that's why in my work with my dancers, it's always collaboration. There's always discussion. There's always a space. If they don't want to do something, you don't have to do it. You do make the choice of what you want to do within the work. So I'll stop there, and I will thank you, and I will let Andrea jump in.
Thanks, Brendan, for giving us like so much to think with, and like visual stimulation, I think already can kind of imagine ways that will enliven our conversation going ahead, just the symbols that you shared with us. Yeah, so I work, my name's Andrea. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm wearing a kind of stretchy collared black gray shirt, and sitting in front of a desk light as the sun sets, with kind of, I guess, chin length hair, dark hair, light dark hair. And I teach in the music department, but I'm really interested in situating culturally specific notions of sound, listening, and music in conversation with ideas about making political change. And the kind of the most iconic ideas of political change that come up are often protests. And I think it was really interesting, Brendan, that you kind of started with big spaces, the most public of a space, people walking through a city kind of in a uniform that makes them look, or like the promenade that makes them feel or recognizable, signify protest, and then kind of into the club space, a container, a place of sameness, or a place where sameness is valued and articulated as a strength, instead of something to be protested against, and then moving like into really intimate sociality of caring for each other and holding each other, right? This is like these different kind of scopes of political work, and I'm really interested in moving across those. So not thinking about protest just in terms of its loudness, but like kind of like Ginger dropped this in the chat, is just thinking about vibes, right? And how a kind of arts or poetics can set the tone, shape a set of feelings. That's why I passed along the Audre Lorde text for us to start with, is just kind of to like validate, center ourselves in feelings, and to underscore the ways in which that potentiality shares a lot of growing newness out of a feeling space, or out of taking feelings and recognizing feelings, recycling feelings, sharing feelings, shares so much with what Brendan is talking about in his reading of Munoz through his embodied practices and choreography. So I thought we might actually kind of like feel our spaces, feel our bodies a little bit. One of the things I think is really important is to think about in my work is to think about sound as something as part of our sensory experience of the world, right? So sound is something that moves against our bodies, not just our eardrums. And so that's why we thought, Brendan and I thought we would listen to this track. This is by a pretty young, sort of 30 something queer Polish artist. So most of my work is on Eastern Europe, but yeah, that doesn't really matter for the purposes of this conversation. I'm kind of always interested in communicating across culturally specific moments, but this artist is someone who's really interested in undoing some of the masculine presence in electronic music scenes, especially in terms of like bodily vulnerability for queer, POC, trans-identifying art, like participants on the dance floor, right? Not just DJs. And she tends to stay very low. And I thought we would just start, or Brendan and I thought we would start by, in order to, start having a conversation, is start by like asking you to do something really unusual as you listen to this. And I would invite you, as I always invite students, to listen to this in any way that you feel comfortable. So if you need to like duck down, lie down on the floor, close your eyes, any of those things, turn off the lights, whatever you feel comfortable with. If you need, I actually think doodling while listening to music at a desk is a way to kind of get out of the computer space and into your imagination space. So I offer that up too. But what we'd like you to do is, as we play about a minute of this track, which I think is called Ruin, is to drop in the chat one word that's the first word that comes to mind as you're listening. Please try to, I guess, like work against it being ruin. That's, is that fair, Brendan, to give that prompt? Is that too controlling?
No, too controlling, but I was also thinking like, when we were listening to it, maybe even take on the prompt of the way Amanda said that our lecture today is defined by, possibilities of spaces, of the kind of idea of what is a queer space, what is the possibility of a new space, and just maybe let that be a little bit more of a prompt verbally to also kind of go alongside with the sonic side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just play a little bit, and then we can take a moment, maybe just a moment of no talking, and then open up the conversation just as a kind of guide for the next couple minutes.
Yeah, so we just kind of wanted to sort of play with that association, because I was saying to Andrea, like when I was studying years ago, a long time ago, with an artist named Mary Kelly, she would always ask us, a little different, but she would say, when I would say the word AIDS, what comes to mind? And she would do that every year with her classes from the 90s into, I think she still does it, but she wanted to kind of have that association of like, where are we now? What space are we in now? And then she would see in the beginning, it had these words like death, dread, and then eventually, like as time moved, it was like hopeful. It was like, change, progress. And so we kind of wanted to kind of like do this and almost like think about the idea of, within the readings of Muñoz, he talks about queer as a possibility of newness, a possibility of creating something, where time proceeds, and in that, that liveliness, something is also about to change. And so the idea of impending change. And I kind of then thought, when we kind of playing this word association, we kind of create a poem, a concrete poem. And Andrea's text, the Audre Lorde's text kind of talks a lot about this notion of poetry. And so we kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that with you guys, that kind of notion of queer or queerness, and the kind of idea of poetry as kind of defined through these two texts, and how they play with the kind of notion of a possibility, the possibility of something new. And so kind of opening it up here for some questions, or seeing what you guys think about those terms. Like I wrote here, in the text, does anybody have a sense of what poetry means? And you can ask, oh yeah, sorry. If you like, you can talk to us directly, or you can write to us in the chat. And I can see there's a couple of messages.
I think I'm also, maybe I'd highlight a couple of the turns of phrase from Audre Lorde's text, which I think is already trying to move between prose and poetry, and maybe even spoken text, so sounded text and read text. Because I think there was something interesting, you know, there's something really jarring about having like these words in front of my eyes as I was listening, because I felt like it was like invitations, actually not dissimilar to like being on a dance floor and having someone extend their body's response to music or to sound or space to you. And it really, like, this time reading through today, I just kept cherishing this sentence, there are no new ideas, there are only new ways of making them felt. Seemed like such a wonderful, I don't know, Brendan, if you thought that was like a little bit in tension with some of the like really forward momentum, like, I don't know, maybe it's not in tension with the Munoz, but it makes me think about how in electronic tracks like this, or like the whole job of a DJ commanding a night, is supposed to, like, you know, a lot of your words are like filling the space, about hugeness, about, you know, submitting your body. Yeah, that part of it is that we know it's going to climax somehow, right? So there's this kind of like almost sexual energy to this. I mean, there is sexual energy that's inscribed and coded into this music sound world. I don't know how if you think about that when you're working with DJs.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of my work is I work with DJs because and also, you know, I was so excited to work with you, and I think Amanda brought us together because, you know, you work in sound and I work in like movement, but like, you know, the two need to be together, you know, like sometimes I challenge my dancers in the most subtle way where I make them, and they'll say I'm cruel to them because I don't give them any sound. And, you know, so even like listening to this piece, it made me feel hopeful. It made me like, it resonated to the club. It resonated to this moment of, I felt like in the piece, there was a crescendo where we went up and we were kind of going towards a celebration, or this act of like, you know, there's going to be just like, you know, an explosion of fun, or, you know, and letting the body like go. And I think that for me is also part of the kind of notion of queerness, is that there's this kind of idea of letting go of what exists here in the now. And I think there's a real sense of, you know, the presence, and then that possibility, the future. And so I think right now we're living in such strange, precarious political, you know, times, you know. This summer has been one of the most bizarre places for all of us, I'm sure. And, you know, I've really just been thinking about how change comes now. And so I've really been thinking even deeper about these ideas of queering, of finding new possibilities. And I think here, Ginger put a quote from Munoz saying, you know, queering is a longing that propels us forward. Like, and even in that language, there's a notion of like dance movement, moving forward, you know. And I like that space, because it's, you know, if we don't move forward, where do we go? So we have to kind of create that space of poetry, of queerness, to give us, you know, the fortitude to think progressively into another space. You know, I also think of a little bit about this through, you know, through Sunra and you know, the idea of the Afrofuturist, where, you know, the idea that we don't want to be in this place right now, so we're going to find a way to go to another planet. We don't want to be here, you know. And it wasn't about not being wanted. It just was like, we want to, you know, empower ourselves. So I think a lot about, you know, queer space, and this idea of poetry, which I think align, you know, when you read both the text, they're asking for the same thing. And in that idea of wanting, it's about empowering oneself as well, but then empowering, but also finding that empowerment through a greater group of people where we all feel it together. Because if we don't feel it together, then we become, you know, we isolate, we create binaries, we create fracture. And that's where the problem lies. You know, we need to just dismantle that. And so when I even talk about in the piece with the police, for example, we need to dismantle those systems that don't support other bodies, that are challenging other bodies. You know, there's this word that comes up a lot within our discourse now. It's like to decolonize. And I believe that we have to decolonize the spaces, but it still takes time. And so our work and our labor, our efforts will take time, but I still think we need to have that notion of queerness to, again, to propel us forward. I think it's kind of where, you know, I think the two texts really kind of challenge, you know, they talked a lot in you know, the Audre Lorde's text about, you know, the idea of, you know, there's a lot of talk about the past and the present and how, you know, through a newness we can find, again, reflecting back to the future.
I was thinking also about Amanda, I think, wrote Siren Song, looking at or listening, and just thinking about obviously the presence of sirens in your work, Brendan, and thinking about repurposing a sound. And maybe you wouldn't want to, no, I think you use the word repurpose, right? Repurpose a sort of alarm sound, right? And that's something that like musicians have done.
It wasn't the sonic sound of the.
Oh, that was the light.
It was just the lights. But like right now, I'm working on a piece actually with the women's Royal Danish Women's Choir, and I'm working with a composer, and there's 100 women in this choir, and I'm creating a 30-minute score where they're singing the sounds of police sirens. And so like I'm working on this kind of this sonic space, and again they'll be moving and dancing as well, but again very, very, very kind of like military kind of, because they're not dancers, but I want to kind of create these dance patterns. But thinking again about that kind of the social symbols again, like I hear sirens every night, you know, that's kind of what inspired me, because for a while here in Chicago, all I could hear was sirens and police helicopters. And so that's kind of inspired this piece. But for me, it was like, you know, it wasn't about finding a space that made me feel safe. You know, I didn't feel protected. I just was a presence. I remember like when living in New York, like post 9/11, the police would just drive in like procession, like 20 cars with all their sirens on, just to make a symbol that we are here. And that we are here wasn't something that, you know, it made me nervous, and I hadn't done anything. And so, and then also like recently I went for a run, and a police officer stopped me and said, you need to leave, you need to go home. And I was like, why? And he said, because there's a white supremacist group in your neighborhood that's attacking people. You need to go home. So like that idea again, you know, thinking about a safe space, you know, through a queer space is something, again, I think we're trying to strive for. And I think, you know, I'm looking at the chat, there's a lot of stuff happening in the chat here. Like, you know, thinking about, you know, what that means through even like just semantics. Like I think in your text, the word poetry is striving for the same thing. It's just using a different language. And when we say poetry, you know, we think about lexicon, we're thinking about like, you know, wordplay. But I think the way you know, I think here I even wrote, it says, you know, newness grows out of darkness, which is poetry. And, you know, so I think it's, you know, you can put in the other word, newness grows out of darkness, which is queerness. You know, the two of them both are very fickle, strange words, but it's about the definition of how these are being used. And I think within that, we're then finding this space of possibility. And I love that Amanda started the talk by saying, you know, part of this question of liveliness is through this, for us, is through the space of possibility. We're thinking about new liveliness, new ways to exist. And I also love that, you know, we're all gathered here in this virtual space. We're in this virtual space that is our safe space in a certain way. You know, we're also dealing with a pandemic, and, you know, now we gather through these spaces. And one of my biggest challenges recently, you know, as you see of my work, it's about gathering thousands of people. It's about making critical mass. It's about saying we're all the same and we're here under the same auspices. And I think that is a thing that I've been challenged through. And so I heard, Faye saying that you guys, in one of your lectures, you talked about the Zoom platform. And I've been thinking a lot about, safe space, brave space through Zoom. And my new choreography is working with 8 dancers, and we're choreographing and rehearsing and making everything through Zoom. And I'll give you a little sneak peek. And I'm thinking about the filters that we work with, and how those, oh, it says I have no filters. Well, that's not gonna work. Yeah, and how we can play with filters, and if we are all having the same filters, I'm working with a graphic designer to create these filters. If we all have the same background, are we in the same space? And again, that same space also has like a resonance of being like, not if we're together, but also are we sharing the same space? Like, are we sharing it, and is it ours together? Amanda wrote here, is poetry inherently queer because it leaves space for possibilities and interpretations? And I think that, I feel that, is poetry inherently queer because it leaves space for possibilities and interpretations? I think it is. Because I think that in that concept of poetry, there, even when you read poetry, there's, in its most literal form, poetry is about interpretation, right? Or finding a meaning that might be a meaning that can change as well. And I think that's something that I've been kind of putting forward through conflating both the readings together.
Yeah, and also someone just pointed out, I don't know how you say your name, Melly, but you pointed out that Audre Lorde, like, really, I mean, this is kind of, well, from my perspective, a little bit of datedness of the text, because it's so centered on motherhood. And of course, we want to, like, we would probably, or I would imagine writing today, there would be ways of radically making that concept very inclusive, but insisting still on, I think, what she's doing there, which is obviously to center womanness. I mean, she says that explicitly in the text, but I think what she's doing there is actually rewriting or queering the notion of control as one of power. Like, the creativity is not a move that is about controlling, but is a move of power and then ceding control, sort of along the narrative of birthing. At least that was my reading. And I think it's really interesting with what Amanda talked about, like, what is inherent about these art forms? Are they overlapping in their potentialities for change, queerness, embodiment, liveness? It's one of the reasons I shared this pretty recent photograph from protest movements in Poland in August, after a non-binary individual was wrongfully, essentially, or illegally imprisoned for protest action, which has been a strategy by the sort of new right Polish populist government for a very long time, is to codify that a kind of civil society movements cannot protest in the ways that we tend to think is normative in democracies, but they're actually interacting with one of the kind of least, or what I think is a very unqueer monument. And I think they're kind of releasing its inherent queerness that's been blocked from us. Precisely, like, I would read it along one of the quotes that Lauren threw in the chat, that's like, if the horizon is so important, this kind of visual metaphor, this like endless space, right? That, like, in Brendan's work, I hear that in there, you're like, the floors move around, they vibrate, they change every day when you're doing this project, and letting people come in and see the emergence of it, right? There's this kind of vulnerability to that ceding of control of the creative process. But, like, all of a sudden, this sword on this is like, this merperson is the symbol, or mermaid really, is a symbol of the city of Warsaw. And they repurpose this violent, threatening sword, or maybe like triumphant championing sword of the state, with this like flag waving, like look, like, it just changes the whole way I, like, literally my eyes look at that piece, but also how when I try and imagine myself standing around that monument, it's all of a sudden not something where the monument intimidates, but the monument invites, this child, like, climbing all over it. It allows bodies to orient, creates a space around it that to me is inherently like just like riffing on Amanda's word, like inherently queer there. Now
I'm just reading all the amazing stuff that people are saying.
Yeah,
It's
so
really
interesting.
super generative and exciting. I was just thinking too about, here, where is it? The idea of, Lord seems to frame the disappeared. Lord seems to frame the essay as being about poetry as the light by which we make change and birth concept. And then I think Ginger also said, besides, birthing children, there's other things that we birth. We birth ideas, we're birthing so many different things. So
yeah, that's what I was kind of like awkwardly trying to formulate. I apologize.
No, but I just wanted to say that the idea also comes here. I keep on saying it's like, we are making change, or we're striving for change. And so the question of we-ness, right? Again, a group, a togetherness, a solidarity. It's not, there's no I, or you, it's a we space. And I think that's something that's really important to remember, this question of we-ness. And that sounded really weird, but we as one is what I'm thinking about. We as one is more better than we-ness. So yeah, I think that there's that space as well.
Makes me think, like, what do you think happens to things when they become codified and defined and known? Do they remain queer, or is queerness does it need to be in this state of birthing, in this state of becoming?
I think it's in the state of birthing and the state of becoming. And I think that, again, I also align this a lot with Marxism and, the kind of the space of, of communism, like that, we've never experienced that. We've created a fear about it. But in that moment, if it actually fully could be resolved and happen, it could be a better way to live than under a capitalist agenda that we're in right now.
Yeah, and I think Don brought up a stuff about gentrification, and I see a continual co-option of radical movements and of protest movements. And even when I look at that photo, I wonder, did they do it for an Instagram post? Like, how much of our actions are for themselves and how much of them are for this projection or this, And even,
I mean, there's even, sorry.
Go ahead. No, I'm done.
Yeah, in the Eastern European context, there was more about 10 years ago, a huge pushback against the use of the word queer, and it's changed with the politics, but even different concepts of gender, that because they come from a Western capitalist notion of what queerness is, that comes out of movements that were not ongoing, and actually in the process allowed ways of being, not identifying with the gender that you're assigned at birth, let those fit, that were very prominent and had lively subcultures in Eastern Europe under communism. It let those fade away and became this hegemonic discourse, right? And there are people absolutely who not just critique this protest as a media event, but actually as a moment where the flag comes from the US, the words come from the US, all this kind of, and so it's not as linked with a long tradition, right? And I think it's just it's a moment of constant revision and critique. And it's where I sometimes read the Munoz and I think, yeah, we need to move beyond the romances of the negative. And then I'm like, no, the negative is a really crucial part of checking oneself, right? And checking the community and checking each other. And that, yeah, a lot of coalition building really needs, and actually, someone's mentioning Silent Sam, which always comes up with monuments still. But actually, until this movement, the most common movements around monuments in the East were the inversion of what we see in North Carolina or in the South in the United States, where people would, the government would shroud former Marxist, communist, socialist, intellectual heroes to hide the communist history, and new popular movements would take the shrouds off. So it's the dismantling was done from above instead of from below, which reframes the action. So there's tons of, there's a lot of complexity to this.
Yeah, and a couple of things like I wanted to kind of like go back to Ginger. One said that, you know, gay bars as a place of segregation, and you know, I think within like, you know, even like, you know, queer communities, we still have like segregation, and you know, I think gay is definitely a different term, and being gay is different than what a queer person is identifies. And then I go back to what Dawn said, and thanks for sharing that. You know, there was a negative connotation to the word queer. Queer also is a very academic word that is also privileged. You know, we are in the academy, we have queer departments, and I feel it's also kind of like a buzzword at times, you know, to deal with it. And sometimes I also feel within the academy, it's like, well, my queer is more queer than your queer. Like, you know, like, so they build like this kind of like this hierarchy. And it's like, you know, if I identify as a gay man, but is also queer, you know, who is queer, you know, what does that mean? And I feel like, you know, what we need to do as within queer spaces is to dismantle, and I'm going to say it again, and break down binaries, you know. So, you know, I can identify in my way, but there's still self-inclusivity. I put myself into the category of queer, which was a term that had its connotations the same way as faggot would be, but we've empowered it to make it something that's different. And I think that also is, you know, the space of change, the space of becoming something else. You know, as I said, you know, I think within the process of time and liveliness, we are always becoming something else.